You're nothing but dead weight to this company. Ryan, we've been carrying you for years, my boss sneered as the holiday party fell silent. The laughter and clinking glasses freezing midair, every colleague, intern, and executive turning their eyes on me as though I had suddenly been revealed for what I truly was. A fraud unmasked in front of the people I had once considered my second family. And I could feel the heat crawling up my neck as if the tailored navy suit I wore had transformed into shackles, binding me to this humiliating stage they had constructed around me without my consent. And though the music had stopped, though the room was nothing but a vacuum of whispers and smothered laughter, there was a strange ringing in my ears as if some deeper part of me already knew that this moment, this cruel spectacle, was the beginning of something none of them would see coming, something they would regret in ways they could not yet imagine. Because I carried with me a secret advantage, a single card I had hidden so deeply that even now, standing in the ashes of my reputation, I could almost taste the sweetness of the day it would be played. But of course I swallowed it back, wearing my shame like armor, letting them think I was broken. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Ryan Carter. I'm 39 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a mechanic and a waitress, and I built everything I had, or thought I had, from the grease-stained floor of my father's garage to the high-rise glass offices of downtown Chicago, where I fought tooth and nail to rise above the crowd, the same crowd that now stared at me as though I had been reduced to nothing. And it's funny how quickly admiration turns to ridicule once blood is in the water, because the men I thought were my mentors and the colleagues I once mentored myself all turned their eyes away, unable to face me, or worse, relieved to see someone else on the chopping block, and the only sound in that moment was the ice shifting in half-melted whiskey glasses and the click of high heels retreating toward the exit, as if my failure were contagious. The humiliation was deliberate. I see that now, not an impulsive outburst from Douglas, our CEO and the man who had once shaken my hand over a greasy diner table when he first recruited me, saying, "We'll build this together, you and me." But a calculated strike, sharpened by the quiet smirks of two men who stood at his side, Trevor and Mason, my so-called peers on the executive team, who had long coveted the projects I poured my soul into, the restructuring strategies, the acquisition pitches, the automation pipeline I designed to cut costs without cutting people. And when I saw Mason's lips twitch upward, I knew the betrayal wasn't just Douglas's bitterness or drunken theatrics. It was the culmination of years of jealousy, backroom whispers, and the hunger for control. And I should have seen it coming. I should have remembered the way Trevor used to study me too closely in meetings. Not just the slides, but my rhythm, my cadence, like he was learning how to become me, how to beat me at my own game. But back then I mistook it for admiration, maybe even respect, because I was loyal. I believed in the covenant of work, in the idea that if you poured yourself into something bigger than you, it would carry you too, and that faith blinded me. Douglas slammed his glass down on the stage when I didn't respond, whiskey splattering like spilt truth, and said loudly, "Tell them, Ryan. Tell them how you nearly cost us the biggest contract of the year, how your incompetence almost sank us all." And the crowd gasped as if on cue, though no one there knew the details, because the truth hadn't been incompetence. It had been sabotage. A report rewritten behind my back. A budget altered in ways only someone with internal clearance could manage. And though I had suspected for weeks, I never imagined they would use it not only to wound me, but to publicly erase me. And in that moment, as I stood silent under the glare of the hotel ballroom lights, I realized silence was my only weapon. Because to fight then would have been to play their game, and I needed time, I needed patience. I needed them to think they had won. Later that night, after the applause had resumed awkwardly, after the band picked up a tune and people returned to their champagne as though nothing life-altering had just occurred, I sat in my car in the freezing parking garage, hands on the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the black glass of the dashboard. And I remembered the company coffee mug Douglas had given me my first week on the job. Cheap ceramic with the logo half faded, a little slogan printed on the side that read, "Trust builds towers." And I laughed, a bitter hollow sound that echoed in the still air, because that mug still sat on my desk upstairs, chipped at the rim but still holding strong. And I thought then how fitting it was, because trust had built towers for them. But it would also be the thing that brought those towers crashing down. I drove home along the lakefront that night, the city lights glittering against the black water, my pulse pounding like war drums. And though I looked every bit the defeated man, tie loosened, eyes hollow, there was a calmness growing inside me, The same calmness my father once told me he felt right before a big fight back in his reckless youth, when the world slowed down and every insult, every bruise, every betrayal became fuel. And I swore to myself, gripping that steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, that I would not just clear my name. I would take everything they had stolen from me and leave them standing in the ruins of their own greed. And as the night stretched out and the city disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt the first spark of the fire that would carry me through the storm. The spark of revenge disguised as resignation, and though they believed they had ended me tonight, they had only written the first chapter of a story that would not belong to them. "They're cutting you out, Ryan. You just need to accept that," my old assistant Emily whispered as she handed me a cardboard box to pack the remnants of my office, and I could feel the weight of her pity pressing heavier than the framed certificates and files I was stacking inside, because in her eyes I was no longer the man who strode through these glass-walled halls with purpose, but the man everyone avoided eye contact with. The cautionary tale whispered over break-room coffee, and I didn't tell her that I knew more than they thought I did, that behind my lowered gaze and tired posture was the quiet scaffolding of a plan already rising, because showing even a flicker of defiance would ruin the illusion I needed them to believe, that Ryan Carter had been gutted, stripped of pride and power, and was stumbling toward the exit with his tail between his legs. And yet as I carried that box through the silent corridor of the 27th floor, past desks that once buzzed with respect and recognition, I forced myself to memorize every smirk, every half-hidden smile, because resentment was a ledger, and I was keeping it balanced. The company cafeteria had always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and disinfectant, but that morning it reeked of betrayal, because Douglas and Mason were seated at the head table, laughing loudly, their voices carrying across the tiled floor, as though to ensure I heard them, Mason leaning in with his smug grin saying, "It's funny how quickly the golden boys tarnish," and Douglas chuckling, clapping him on the back, while Trevor kept his eyes low, pretending to read something on his phone, and I almost respected his restraint because he knew gloating wasn't his strength. His strength was patience, deception, the kind of man who didn't laugh while the knife was still wet, but waited until it had dried and been mounted on the wall. And as I passed them with my box, Mason said, not even lowering his voice, "Guess we'll finally see real results without dead weight dragging us down." And the cafeteria erupted in nervous laughter, people pretending it was harmless banter, but I saw the flash in Douglas's eyes, the gleam of triumph, and I knew then that humiliation wasn't enough for them. They wanted erasure, they wanted me so crushed that even the shadow of my name wouldn't linger. I spent the next weeks drifting through the wreckage of my life as they thought they had left it, making appearances at the office only when required, nodding meekly in meetings where my projects were rebranded under Mason's name, watching from the back row as Trevor pitched one of my strategies as if it had sprung from his mind fully formed, and each time I forced myself to clap politely, to smile thinly, because I knew every performance of submission was buying me time to map their moves, time to prepare mine, and late at night in my small apartment overlooking the highway with the hum of trucks below, and the faint smell of grease from the diner next door, I pieced together the puzzle, pulling strings they couldn't see. A small victory came one cold February morning, when an internal audit flagged inconsistencies in a budget Mason had altered. And for a moment I thought justice might arrive early, that perhaps the system had enough integrity to expose what I knew, but within a day the report had been buried, overwritten by Douglas's signature, smoothed out as though it had never existed, and Mason strutted into the office wearing a new Rolex, mocking me with its reflection, and I realized then that justice wasn't a gift waiting for the deserving, it was a weapon forged by the betrayed, and I would need to forge mine carefully. The hardest blow came not from them, but from within, when my father called me from Ohio after hearing rumors from an old family friend who worked in finance, his voice cracking with confusion, saying, "Son, tell me it's not true what they're saying about you, that you stole from your own company." And though I denied it with every fiber of truth in me, I could hear the hesitation in his silence. The doubt born not from mistrust, but from exhaustion, from a life that had taught him that good men often lose. And that was when the shame finally struck deeper than the humiliation, because it wasn't just my career they had sabotaged, it was my name, my family's faith. And I swore silently that if I couldn't restore their belief in me through honesty, I would restore it through vengeance, through proving that the men who had branded me a fraud were the real thieves. Still, appearances had to be maintained, so I let the weeks drag into months. I let myself be seen at the corner diner flipping through classifieds as if searching for meaningless work. I let rumors of a job hunt spread through the grapevine. And I even let Douglas shake my hand one last time in front of the board, his grip firm, his smile wolfish as he said, "No hard feelings, Ryan. Sometimes not everyone's cut out for the big leagues." And I smiled back, hollow, knowing the board saw me as a failed investment, a risk no longer worth protecting, and yet behind my polite nod I was memorizing every detail of that moment. The smug twitch in Mason's brow, Trevor's silence, the glint of the company logo embossed on the conference room wall, because symbols mattered, and the mug on my desk, still chipped and waiting, reminded me daily that the phrase, "trust builds towers," had not yet completed its meaning. But even in my darkest hours, I nurtured small flames of hope, like when Emily sent me a late-night text saying she believed me, that she had overheard Mason shredding documents, that she was willing to help, and though I didn't let her in fully, I let her words steady me, because betrayal could hollow a man, but loyalty, even in fragments, could patch the cracks long enough to keep him standing. And each day I stood, I was closer to the reckoning they didn't yet know was marching toward them. The cruel irony was that their arrogance became my camouflage, because the more I appeared broken, the less they suspected me of moving quietly behind the scenes, gathering copies of reports, old emails, scraps of correspondence I had once saved for no reason at all. And while they toasted their victories in the glittering restaurants downtown, I sat in my apartment surrounded by files, piecing together not just their fraud but the architecture of their downfall, brick by brick, until the shape of the trap began to emerge. A trap they would walk into with smiles on their faces, believing themselves untouchable. The weeks bled into spring, and by the time the city thawed from its winter shell, the company had rebranded itself around Mason and Trevor's stolen work, billboards flashing their faces, trade magazines quoting their words, and Douglas preening as though he alone had shepherded the firm into a golden era. While my own name became nothing more than a stain they refused to scrub clean, a cautionary whisper to interns about ambition unchecked. And I knew then that humiliation wasn't enough for them. They wanted permanence. They wanted to salt the earth of my career so nothing could grow again. And yet what they couldn't see was that permanence has a funny way of being temporary when pride blinds a man to the cracks in his own foundation, because every tower looks eternal until the moment it begins to crumble, and I was already loosening the bricks. My secret advantage, the one I hinted at in the silence of that holiday party months ago, was buried not in flashy contracts or balance sheets, but in the small, overlooked detail of our digital pipeline, the automation system I had architected years ago that touched every transaction, every deal, every approval, a system so integral to operations that dismantling it would risk collapse. And yet, because I had built it, because only I truly understood its veins and arteries, I had left a skeleton key, a buried function invisible in the code that allowed me access long after my credentials were revoked. And while Douglas, Mason, and Trevor believed they had locked me out, I was still moving through the shadows of their empire, watching as they doctored numbers, siphoned bonuses, inflated valuations, all while congratulating themselves on a victory not yet complete, and each file I pulled, each timestamp I saved, was another nail in the coffin they were busy hammering shut around themselves. The ticking clock arrived in the form of an upcoming board audit, a mid-year review scheduled for June. One Douglas spoke about as if it were a coronation, boasting at cocktail hours that the board would greenlight an expansion into Europe, that investor confidence had never been higher, and I smiled quietly to myself, sipping cheap beer at the corner diner, because I knew that very audit would become the stage where masks slipped, where the same arrogance that had humiliated me would undo them. But still the preparation consumed me. Nights blurred into mornings as I pored over spreadsheets and email chains, connecting dots the auditors would never bother to connect on their own, building not just a case but a story, because I knew stories were more powerful than numbers. And if I wanted to destroy them, the way they destroyed me, I couldn't just expose fraud. I had to show the betrayal, to let the board feel the same shock I had felt in that ballroom. Yet the closer I drew to June, the tighter their grip became, and there were days when I nearly faltered. Like when Emily texted me frantically one night saying Mason had cornered her in the office, warning her that helping me would ruin her, that she should learn from my fall from grace. And I nearly called her back to tell her to stop, to save herself. But then she sent me one final message. "Don't worry, I copied everything. They're scared, Ryan." And that line lit a fire under me, because if Mason was resorting to intimidation, it meant he felt the walls inching closer. even if he couldn't yet see the trap being built around him. Still, victory was not without cost, and the cost came in the form of my own unraveling. Sleepless nights spent pacing the apartment, reliving the humiliation again and again, hearing Douglas's voice sneering in my skull, and sometimes I wondered if revenge was enough, if even their ruin could stitch me back together. But then I would see the chipped mug on my desk. Trust builds towers, and I would whisper to myself, and towers fall, as if the words themselves were a mantra, reminding me that poetic justice would matter, that symbols carried power the way swords once did, and that phrase, once a joke, would become the blade I wielded. May rolled into June, and the audit loomed like thunderclouds. The entire company buzzing with forced enthusiasm, executives rehearsing their speeches, junior analysts polishing numbers, and I kept to the shadows, waiting, feeding the storm, until the night before the review when I sat in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of files, every piece of evidence labeled, cross-referenced, impossible to deny. And for the first time since that holiday party, I allowed myself to imagine the moment not just of their downfall, but of my own release. The silence after the storm when I would no longer carry their betrayal like a stone in my chest. But fate has a way of testing a man at the edge of victory, and the test came when my apartment door rattled with the sound of fists pounding against it. And when I opened it, 2 men in dark suits flashed badges. Federal investigators asking about irregularities tied to my name. Accusations that I had maintained unauthorized access to company systems, that I was the one manipulating numbers, that I was the ghost in the machine stealing from my own people, and though I kept my voice steady, though I let them search, I realized with a sick twist of irony that Douglas and his dogs had moved faster than I expected, preemptively framing me once again, laying the groundwork to turn my secret advantage into a weapon against me, and as they left with polite but pointed warnings, I sat in the half-darkness of my apartment, heart hammering, realizing the trap I had been building might also be a noose tightening around my own neck. It was then that I caught the smallest detail, a subtle clue hidden in the mountain of files Emily had passed to me, an innocuous memo signed by Douglas himself, authorizing access codes that should have been sealed after my exit, proof that the very system they accused me of exploiting had been deliberately left open by them to frame me, and in that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. Because I understood that their arrogance hadn't just left a trail, it had left the exact evidence I needed to turn the tables completely, a flaw so small they would never notice until it was too late. That was the mini-reveal, the shift I hadn't expected, the realization that all the times I thought they were simply erasing me, they had actually been writing my vindication in invisible ink, and all I had to do was shine the right light on it at the right time. So I doubled down, restructured the evidence, threaded that overlooked memo like a fuse through everything else I had built, and by the morning of the audit I knew that if I played it right, their victory banquet would become their execution chamber, but I also knew the risk had never been higher, that one wrong move and I would not only lose revenge but freedom, perhaps everything, and yet as I dressed that morning, buttoning a crisp shirt and knotting my tie for the first time in months, I felt strangely calm, as if all the humiliation, all the betrayals, all the sleepless nights had been narrowing me toward this single day, this singular strike, and when I lifted the chipped mug from my desk for one last sip of bitter coffee, I smiled at the irony that trust had indeed built towers. But it would be mistrust, betrayal, and my quiet patience that would bring those towers crashing down in front of the very people who believed they were untouchable. The boardroom that morning smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee, the kind of sterile environment where fortunes are decided with calm voices and carefully folded hands. And as I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, officially listed as a guest for the audit review, I could feel every eye flick toward me in confusion, whispers darting like flies because for months I had been a ghost. The disgraced former executive no one expected to see again, and yet here I was in a crisp suit, posture straight, the chipped mug I had carried in my box of belongings now sitting deliberately in front of me, a silent symbol of what they had forgotten, and across from me sat Douglas, Trevor, and Mason, their smiles thin and rehearsed, though I could see the twitch in Mason's jaw, the way Trevor's hand fiddled with his pen, the brief flash of surprise in Douglas's eyes before he covered it with that politician's grin, and he leaned forward to say, "Ryan, what a surprise! I wasn't aware you'd be joining us today." His voice smooth but taut with irritation because he knew surprises rarely boded well in rooms like this, and I smiled back, letting silence stretch just long enough to unnerve him. Before the auditors began their presentation, screens lighting up with charts and numbers designed to prove the company's unprecedented success. For the first half hour I said nothing, letting Mason strut through his stolen strategies, letting Trevor charm the board with his easy cadence, letting Douglas bask in the glow of their orchestrated lies, but inside I felt that calmness again. The same calmness I had tasted on the night of my humiliation, when everything had burned and yet some deeper part of me had already begun rebuilding. And I knew the timing had to be perfect. The strike had to land when their pride was at its highest point, because that's when the fall cuts deepest. The chairman of the board, a silver-haired man named Whitmore, finally leaned back, tapping his papers, and said, "Gentlemen, your numbers are impressive, though we will of course be examining them more closely." And Douglas puffed up like a peacock, replying, "We have nothing to hide, sir." And the irony nearly choked me. But I held my tongue until Whitmore's assistant announced the open floor for final comments, and that was when I reached for the chipped mug, lifted it slowly, took a deliberate sip of bitter coffee, and said evenly, "Actually, there's quite a bit to hide." The room froze, a silence heavier than the one in the holiday ballroom months ago, and Douglas barked a laugh, trying to play it off. "Ryan, really, this isn't the time." But I set the mug down with a soft ceramic clink and slid a folder across the table, its contents spilling like blood from a wound, emails, budget discrepancies, authorization memos, all tied together with a single signature at the bottom of a memo. His signature, authorizing my continued access. Months after my departure, the smoking gun that flipped the narrative, because suddenly the man who had painted me as a fraud was the one who had enabled the supposed fraud himself. Whitmore frowned, leaning forward, the auditors scrambling through the pages, their voices rising in confusion. And Trevor shifted uncomfortably, while Mason's smirk finally cracked, his eyes darting to Douglas as if to say, "You said you had this covered." And I let the silence swell again before delivering the next blow. The drive I had hidden in my jacket pocket, which contained the skeleton keys audit trail, every manipulation Mason and Trevor had executed under Douglas's watch, all time-stamped, all irrefutable, and I said, my voice steady but ringing with years of swallowed humiliation, "Gentlemen, you framed me, you humiliated me, and you thought you had buried me. But what you forgot is that towers built on lies don't stand forever. They collapse under their own weight, and today you're going to feel every stone as it falls." Gasps rippled through the room as the evidence scrolled across the screen, projections unraveling into proof of embezzlement, falsified reports, theft from shareholders, and Whitmore's face darkened as he demanded answers. Douglas sputtering, Trevor stammering, Mason breaking into sweat, but the twist was not just in the exposure, it was in what followed, because as they panicked, as Douglas slammed his fist and accused me of fabricating everything, I calmly pulled out the letter from the federal investigators who had visited me weeks earlier, their names neatly printed at the bottom, and I explained how they had come to my door, accusing me of the very crimes now proven to belong to them, and how, when I turned over the files, those same investigators realized the scope of what was happening, how they had quietly begun their own inquiry, and how, as of that very morning, indictments were being prepared. The double twist landed when the board secretary entered the room, whispering urgently to Whitmore, who then announced in a grave voice that federal agents were downstairs in the lobby, here to take statements, and the color drained from Douglas's face so completely I thought he might collapse, Mason muttering curses under his breath, Trevor whispering furiously about deals cut behind the scenes, and in that moment I saw it all click for them. The trap they had laid for me had become the gallows they themselves were walking toward, each of them shackled by their own greed, their own arrogance. As chaos erupted, I sat still, hands folded, the chipped mug by my side like a sentinel. And for the first time in months, the weight in my chest lifted, not because I had destroyed them, though I had, but because I was finally free of their shadow, free of the need to prove myself to men who never valued me, and I realized that revenge, as sweet as it tasted, was only half the victory. The other half was the peace that came from knowing I had turned betrayal into justice. The board dismissed me quietly afterward, some offering nods of respect, others too shocked to speak, and as I walked out of that glass tower into the Chicago sun, the city humming with life as though nothing had happened, I carried nothing but the chipped mug in my hand, its slogan staring back at me, "Trust builds towers," and I smiled, whispering to myself, "and betrayal brings them down." The double twist, of course, came later, when news broke that Douglas had not only stolen from the company, but had siphoned funds into personal offshore accounts, dragging Mason and Trevor deeper into the pit. And the three of them turned on one another like wolves in a trap, each cutting deals, each exposing more rot, until the empire they built on my back was nothing but rubble in the financial press. And people who once laughed at me now whispered my name again, not as a fraud, but as the man who survived the fire and walked away with dignity. And yet the final satisfaction wasn't in the headlines or the whispered apologies from old colleagues. It was in the quiet moment back in my apartment when I placed the chipped mug on the shelf. No longer a symbol of pain but of survival, a reminder that trust, betrayal, ambition, humiliation, and revenge were all pieces of the same story, and that story had ended not with my ruin, but with theirs. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.